What if everything you've been taught about inspiration is completely backwards? What if the most influential person in human history didn't inspire people through charisma, miracles, or divine authority, but through a psychological method so counterintuitive that modern science is only now catching up? For 2,000 years, we've missed the real secret behind how Jesus transformed ordinary fishermen into world changers, how he turned doubt into unshakable conviction, and how his influence spread faster than any idea in human history. The truth isn't what you think. It's hidden in plain sight, embedded in every interaction he had, and it's so powerful that when you understand it, you'll never see leadership, persuasion, or human motivation the same way again. This changes everything. If you're building anything that matters, the most powerful influence method in history was hidden for 2,000 years. What Jesus understood about human psychology that modern leaders are just discovering will change everything. Here's what everyone gets wrong about Jesus and inspiration. We've been told for centuries that people followed him because of his divine authority, his miracles, or his charismatic presence. Religious scholars point to supernatural events. Leadership experts focus on his teachings. Historians emphasize his cultural context. But they're all missing the psychological pattern that made him genuinely unstoppable. Look at the data differently. In less than 3 years, a carpenter from an insignificant village transformed 12 ordinary men into leaders who would spread his message to every corner of the known world. These weren't educated elites or natural-born leaders. Peter was impulsive and doubt-ridden. Thomas was a chronic skeptic. Matthew was a despised tax collector. Judas would eventually betray him. Yet somehow, 11 of these men became so inspired, they were willing to die rather than stop spreading his message. Traditional explanations fall apart under scrutiny. If divine authority was the key, why did people constantly question him? If miracles were the answer, why did those who witnessed them often remain unconvinced? If charisma was the secret, why do the gospel accounts describe him as ordinary in appearance, sometimes harsh in response, and frequently misunderstood even by his closest followers? The real mystery isn't that people followed Jesus. The real mystery is why they stayed inspired long after he was gone, without any of the traditional tools of influence. No political power, no wealth, no institutional backing, no physical presence. Yet his movement exploded across the Roman Empire faster than any idea before or since. Something else was happening, something psychological. Something that neuroscience is only now beginning to understand about how human motivation actually works. The traditional story of divine inspiration blinds us to a method so sophisticated that it revolutionizes everything we think we know about influencing human behavior. This isn't about religion or theology. This is about uncovering the psychological operating system that made the most successful influence campaign in human history actually work. And it starts with understanding why everything we've been taught about inspiration is backwards. Here's the pattern that changes everything. Jesus didn't inspire people by giving them answers. He inspired them by teaching them to ask better questions. Modern neuroscience reveals something fascinating about human motivation. When we're given direct answers or commands, our brains activate what psychologists call psychological reactance, an automatic resistance to being told what to think or do. But when we discover insights through questions, our brains release dopamine and create lasting neural pathways associated with ownership and conviction. Jesus understood this instinctively. Look at how he actually interacted with people. When someone asked him a question, he almost always responded with another question. Who do you say that I am? What do you want me to do for you? Which of these three was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? He turned questioners into discoverers. This pattern appears in hundreds of recorded interactions. When Peter declared his faith, Jesus didn't say correct answer. Instead, he asked deeper questions that led Peter to discover the implications of his own belief. When the rich young ruler asked about eternal life, Jesus didn't lecture him about charity. He asked a question that revealed what the man truly valued most. Even his famous parables were elaborate questions disguised as stories. The Good Samaritan parable wasn't a moral instruction. It was a psychological puzzle that forced listeners to examine their own assumptions about love, prejudice, and identity. The prodigal son story wasn't about forgiveness. It was about forcing people to discover which character they identified with and why. This method created something unprecedented: self-generating inspiration. Instead of depending on Jesus' presence or authority to maintain their motivation, his followers had internalized a process of discovery. They had learned to ask the kinds of questions that led to their own insights, their own convictions, their own transformation. This explains why the movement exploded after his death rather than collapsing. His followers weren't just repeating memorized teachings. They were equipped with a psychological method for continuous discovery and inspiration. They could inspire others not through authority or charisma, but by teaching them the same process of transformative questioning. Modern cognitive science calls this elaborative interrogation, one of the most powerful learning and motivation techniques ever discovered. When people generate insights through guided questioning rather than passive reception, those insights become integrated into their identity and value system in ways that direct instruction never achieves. Jesus had cracked the code of human psychology 2,000 years before we had the science to understand why it worked. Think of inspiration like a fire. Most people try to create inspiration the way someone might try to light a campfire by throwing a burning torch at a pile of logs. It might create some flames, but they'll die out quickly because the wood hasn't been properly prepared. Jesus understood that real inspiration works like starting a fire with tinder and kindling. You don't force the flame. You create the conditions where the fire can start itself and sustain itself. Questions are the spark, curiosity is the tinder, and personal discovery is the kindling that creates a self-sustaining flame of motivation. When you ask someone the right question at the right moment, you're not imposing your ideas on them. You're helping them discover what's already inside them, waiting to be ignited. The inspiration feels like it came from within because, psychologically, it did. They own it in a way that no external motivation could ever achieve. This is why Jesus' followers remained inspired for decades after his death. They weren't carrying around borrowed enthusiasm that would eventually fade. They had learned to create their own fire. They possessed the psychological flint and steel to generate inspiration wherever they went. The method works because it aligns with how the human brain actually processes and integrates new information. We don't just believe what we're told, we believe what we discover. We don't stay motivated by external pressure. We stay motivated by internal conviction. And internal conviction comes from personal insight, which comes from asking ourselves the right questions at the right time. This wasn't just a teaching technique. It was a psychological technology for creating lasting behavioral change and sustained motivation. A technology so advanced that modern cognitive science is only now catching up to its sophistication. And this was just the beginning. The question method was only the first layer of an influence system that revolutionized how human motivation actually works. If this is exploding your mind, stop now and hit the subscribe button. Why? Because what comes next will blow your perspective on human influence. And if you don't subscribe, the algorithm will hide my next secrets from you. Now here's where it gets really strange. Once Jesus had people asking better questions, he did something that defies everything we know about motivation and inspiration. He made following him harder, not easier. Look at the pattern. Every time his movement gained momentum, every time crowds grew larger and more enthusiastic, Jesus would do something that seemed to sabotage his own success. He'd give a teaching so challenging that many followers would leave. He'd make demands that seemed unreasonable. He'd talk about suffering, sacrifice, and taking up crosses. Modern influence theory says this should have killed his movement. People are motivated by benefits, not costs. They're inspired by promises of gain, not threats of loss. They follow leaders who make their lives easier, not harder. Yet Jesus consistently did the opposite, and somehow his influence only grew stronger. Consider the specific moments when this happened. After feeding 5,000 people, a moment of peak popularity and obvious miraculous power, he gave a teaching about eating his flesh and drinking his blood that was so disturbing that John's Gospel records From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. Any normal leader would have backtracked, softened the message, or offered clarification to prevent the exodus. Instead, Jesus turned to his 12 closest followers and asked, "You do not want to leave too, do you?" He didn't chase after those who left. He didn't modify his message to be more palatable. He made it clear that following him would only get more difficult, not less. When a rich young ruler approached him with enthusiasm about eternal life, Jesus could have simply welcomed him into the inner circle. Instead, he demanded that the man sell everything he owned and give it to the poor. When the man walked away sorrowful, Jesus didn't call him back with a compromise offer. He let him go. This pattern appears throughout his ministry. The more popular he became, the more demanding his requirements became. The larger the crowds, the more challenging his teachings. The greater his obvious power and influence, the more he emphasized cost rather than benefit. According to every principle of modern psychology and marketing, this approach should have been disastrous. People are loss-averse. They seek pleasure and avoid pain. They're motivated by what they can gain, not what they might have to sacrifice. Yet somehow, this backwards approach created the most committed, inspired, and lasting movement in human history. The people who stayed didn't just follow Jesus, they became willing to die rather than abandon what they had found. They weren't just motivated, they were transformed. Here's the psychological breakthrough that changes everything about motivation. Jesus understood that inspiration isn't created by lowering barriers, it's created by raising them strategically. Modern behavioral science has discovered something counterintuitive called the effort justification effect. When people invest significant effort or make sacrifices to obtain something, their brain automatically increases the perceived value of that thing to justify the investment. The more someone has to give up or work for something, the more precious it becomes to them psychologically. But Jesus took this principle further. He understood that true inspiration isn't just about valuing something more highly. It's about fundamentally changing your identity to match your investment. When someone makes a costly commitment to a cause or belief, their brain resolves the cognitive dissonance by shifting their self-concept to align with their behavior. This is why his weeding out process was so psychologically sophisticated. By making the requirements progressively more demanding, he was ensuring that only people who were willing to change their identity would continue following. And once someone has changed their identity to match their commitment, that commitment becomes virtually unshakable. Consider what happened to the disciples who stayed. These weren't people who simply agreed with Jesus' teachings or admired his character. These were people who had reorganized their entire sense of self around following him. Peter had given up his fishing business. Matthew had abandoned his lucrative tax collection. They had burned their bridges and bet their futures on this movement. When you've restructured your entire life around something, that something becomes integrated into your core identity. Abandoning it would mean abandoning yourself. This creates a level of motivation and commitment that no external reward or punishment could ever achieve. Jesus also understood the psychological power of scarcity and selectivity. By making his inner circle difficult to join, he created what psychologists call in-group preference, the tendency to value something more highly when it's exclusive. The disciples didn't just follow a teacher. They belonged to a chosen group that had met higher standards than others. This selective process also created what's known as moral licensing. When people who have demonstrated commitment in one area feel psychologically free to make even greater commitments. Each sacrifice the disciples made increased their capacity for even greater sacrifice, creating an upward spiral of dedication. The result wasn't just inspired followers, it was people whose identity had become so intertwined with the movement that abandoning it was psychologically impossible. They weren't following Jesus because he made their lives easier. They were following him because following him had become who they were. This explains why the movement survived his death and persecution. These weren't people whose motivation depended on external rewards or even Jesus' physical presence. Their motivation was internal, identity-based, and self-reinforcing. The more they sacrificed for the movement, the more committed they became. The more they were persecuted, the more their identity as chosen followers was confirmed. Modern cults use twisted versions of this principle to create unhealthy dependency. But Jesus used it to create authentic transformation and sustainable inspiration that outlasted any single individual or circumstance. Imagine inspiration like building muscle. Most people think motivation works like taking a supplement. You add something external to get instant results. But real motivation works like strength training. You deliberately create resistance that forces growth. When you lift weights, the resistance isn't the enemy of strength. It's the creator of strength. The muscle breakdown caused by lifting heavy weights triggers the body's repair mechanisms, which build the muscle back stronger than before. Remove the resistance and growth stops. Jesus understood that psychological strength works the same way. Mental and spiritual muscle is built by overcoming increasingly difficult challenges, not by avoiding them. Each sacrifice, each difficult teaching, each costly commitment was psychological resistance training that made his followers stronger and more committed. This is why people who work hard for something value it more than people who receive it easily. The effort doesn't diminish the value, it creates the value. The sacrifice doesn't reduce the inspiration, it generates the inspiration. Think about your own life. What are you most proud of? What achievements mean the most to you? Chances are, they're the things that required the most effort, the most sacrifice, the most overcoming of obstacles. The difficulty wasn't an unfortunate side effect, it was the source of meaning. Jesus weaponized this principle. By making his movement progressively more demanding, he was essentially putting his followers through increasingly intense inspiration training. Each level of commitment prepared them for the next level. Each sacrifice made them psychologically stronger and more capable of even greater commitment. The people who stayed weren't just motivated, they were transformed. They had developed what you might call inspiration immunity. No amount of persecution, hardship, or opposition could shake their commitment because their commitment had been forged through voluntarily embracing even greater challenges. This wasn't manipulation, it was transformation. The resistance created authentic strength, not artificial dependency. If you're watching this far, you are different from most people. Prove it. Hit that like button now and subscribe. Because people like you deserve to know all the secrets I'll reveal in upcoming videos. But here's the most mind-bending part of Jesus' influence system. After teaching people to ask better questions and training them through progressive commitment, he did something that shouldn't be possible according to everything we know about leadership and inspiration. He made himself unnecessary. Think about this psychologically. Every other influence system in history has created dependency on the influencer. Followers need the leader's presence, approval, guidance, or authority to maintain their motivation. Remove the leader, and the movement collapses. This is true for political movements, business organizations, religious institutions, and even modern social media influencers. Jesus built the opposite system. The more deeply people followed him, the less they needed him. The stronger their commitment became, the more independent their inspiration became. By the end of his ministry, his closest followers weren't just learning from him, they were becoming like him. They weren't just inspired by him, they were becoming sources of inspiration themselves. Look at what actually happened. During his life, the disciples were constantly confused, afraid, and dependent on his explanations and reassurance. Peter denied knowing him when facing pressure. Thomas doubted reports of his resurrection. They argued about who was greatest among them. They fled when he was arrested. These were not people who had achieved independence or strength. Yet within weeks of his death and reported resurrection, these same people had transformed into fearless leaders who spoke with authority, performed their own miraculous healings, and inspired others to the same level of commitment they had found. What changed wasn't just their circumstances. What changed was their fundamental identity and capacity for generating inspiration independently. This pattern appears nowhere else in history. Normally, when a powerful leader dies, the movement either dies with them or splits into competing factions as different people claim authority. But Jesus' movement did the opposite. It exploded with unified energy and purpose that exceeded anything achieved during his lifetime. Even more strange, the disciples didn't try to replace Jesus with a new single leader. Instead, they created a system where multiple people could function with the same kind of influence and inspiration that Jesus had demonstrated. They weren't trying to find another Jesus. They were becoming their own versions of what Jesus had been. This suggests that Jesus' ultimate goal wasn't to create permanent followers, but to create new leaders. Not to maintain dependency, but to eliminate it. Not to be the sole source of inspiration, but to teach others to become sources of inspiration themselves. If true, this represents the most sophisticated understanding of human psychology and leadership development in recorded history. Jesus wasn't just inspiring people, he was teaching them to inspire others. He wasn't just changing behavior, he was transforming capacity. He wasn't building a following, he was building a system for reproducing leadership itself. Here's the final secret that revolutionizes everything. Jesus understood that true inspiration isn't about following someone else's vision. It's about discovering your own capacity to create vision for others. Modern psychology calls this self-efficacy, the belief in your own ability to influence events that affect your life. People with high self-efficacy don't just feel motivated, they become sources of motivation for others. They don't just follow inspiration, they generate it. And this psychological quality can be systematically developed through specific kinds of experiences. Jesus created what we might call an inspiration laboratory. Every interaction with his followers was designed to progressively develop their capacity for independent leadership and influence. The questions weren't just teaching them to think, they were teaching them to think like teachers. The progressive commitments weren't just building their dedication, they were building their capacity to inspire dedication in others. Consider the specific training progression. First, he taught them to ask transformative questions. Then he sent them out in pairs to practice influencing others using the same methods they had learned. When they returned excited about their success, he didn't take credit. He helped them understand that the power had been within them all along. He gradually transferred more responsibility and authority to them. They went from watching him teach and heal to practicing these abilities themselves. They went from being recipients of inspiration to being generators of inspiration. Each success built their confidence that they possessed the same kind of influence capacity they had witnessed in him. The final stage was the most psychologically sophisticated. He removed himself from the equation entirely. Through his death and reported resurrection, he created a situation where they could no longer depend on his physical presence or direct guidance. They had to either abandon everything they had learned or discover that they had internalized the capacity to continue without him. The resurrection accounts, regardless of your theological beliefs, describe a series of experiences designed to prove to the disciples that they possessed independent power and authority. Thomas touching his wounds, Peter being told to feed my sheep, the disciples being commissioned to go and make disciples of all nations. These weren't just spiritual experiences, they were psychological graduation ceremonies. Jesus had created what psychologists call mastery experiences, situations where people discover they can achieve things they previously thought impossible. Each mastery experience builds self-efficacy, which builds confidence, which builds the capacity to inspire that same confidence in others. The result wasn't just inspired followers. It was people who had learned to create inspiration in others using the same psychological principles they had experienced themselves. They didn't just spread Jesus' message, they spread his method. They didn't just convert people to his beliefs, they transformed people into leaders capable of transforming others. This explains the unprecedented expansion of early Christianity. It wasn't spreading through the charisma of a single leader or the authority of an institution. It was spreading through a reproducible system for developing human potential and leadership capacity. Each person who was genuinely transformed became capable of transforming others, creating an exponential rather than linear growth pattern. Jesus had discovered something that modern psychology is only now beginning to understand. The highest form of influence isn't creating followers, it's creating other influencers. The most sustainable inspiration isn't dependency, it's developing other people's capacity for independence. The ultimate leadership isn't being indispensable, it's making yourself unnecessary by making others capable. Picture inspiration like teaching someone to fish versus giving them a fish. But Jesus went 3 levels deeper than that analogy. He didn't just teach people to fish, he taught them to teach others to fish. And then he taught them to create more fishing teachers. He built a self-replicating system of capacity development. Think of it like a master craftsman who doesn't just create beautiful furniture, but teaches apprentices to become master craftsmen themselves, who then teach their own apprentices, creating an expanding network of expertise that grows stronger and more sophisticated over time, rather than weaker and more diluted. Most leaders create hub and spoke systems where everything flows through them. Remove the hub and the system collapses. Jesus created what network scientists call a distributed system, a network where each node has the capacity to function independently and create new nodes. This is why his influence kept growing long after his death. It wasn't depending on memory of his teachings or inspiration from his example. It was a living system where each person who truly understood the method became capable of reproducing the entire transformation process in others. The method works because it aligns with the deepest human psychological needs: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Instead of creating dependency on external authority, it develops internal authority. Instead of requiring permanent guidance, it builds capacity for self-direction. Instead of following someone else's purpose, it helps people discover their own sense of mission and calling. When you truly understand this system, you realize that Jesus wasn't trying to get people to follow him forever. He was trying to help people become the best versions of themselves, versions capable of inspiring others to become their best versions. He was creating a chain reaction of human development that could theoretically continue indefinitely. This is the ultimate inspiration technology, not just motivating people to achieve goals, but developing their capacity to help others achieve their goals. Not just changing behavior, but transforming character. Not just creating followers, but creating leaders who create other leaders. These three secrets, question-based discovery, resistance-generated commitment, and capacity-building leadership, combine into the most powerful influence system ever documented. Jesus didn't inspire people through divine authority or supernatural charisma. He inspired them by helping them discover their own questions, develop their own strength, and find their own capacity to inspire others. This psychological technology was so advanced that we're only now catching up to its sophistication. The methods work because they align with how human motivation actually functions, through personal discovery, earned commitment, and developed capacity. It's not about following someone else's vision, it's about discovering your own power to create vision for others. This changes everything about influence, leadership, and human potential itself. If these secrets exploded your mind, you need to see my next videos. But only if you hit that bell. Otherwise, you'll miss the most powerful secrets in history. What's your opinion on the ideas presented in this content? Leave it in the comments. Send this revelation to that friend who has sharp perception. This analysis is speculative and based on publicly available historical and psychological information, not clinical diagnosis. The interpretations presented are for educational and discussion purposes only.